All right, so we're working on lesson 1-4, patterns and functions. All right, so our first example, we need to suppose that you are buying apples from a vending machine. We're using the table below, and we need to write a function rule. So the first thing we want to do is we want to write our relate statement. All right, so we know that the total cost is 35 cents, or 35 times the number of apples. Right, then we need to find our variables. Well, we don't know the number of apples because it could change, so we're going to let A equal our number of apples. And then we're going to let, so our other piece of information is our cost, so we'll let C equal our total cost. Right now we need to write our equation, so we're going to, we need to be able to figure out what our cost is. So our cost is going to equal 35 cents times each apple, or A. So C equals 0.35 times A. Right, example 2, we need to make a 2-story house by adding one toothpick that goes from side to side. We're using the table to write our function. So we can see that for every house we're making, we would multiply it by 6. So if I multiply 1 by 6 and then add 1 to that, I would get 7. If I multiply 2 by 6, add 1 to that, I would get 13. Multiply 3 by 6, add 1 to what I got, I would get 19. Multiply 4 by 6, add 1, I would get 25. So now we need to write our relate statement. And we know that the number of toothpicks is 1 more than 6 times the number of houses. So now we need to find our variables. So we're going to let H equal the number of houses. And we're going to let T equal the number of toothpicks. Finally, we can write our equation. So to find the number of toothpicks, we would be taking the number of houses, which is H, and multiplying by 6. That's H. So 6H, and then we would add 1 to it. All right, so now we're going to talk about independent and dependent variables. So an independent variable is something on its own. A dependent variable depends on something else happening. All right, so an independent variable is the cause. It can be manipulated. The dependent variable, it's the effect of something happening. It's what we measure. All right, so our example 3, we need to suppose that we want to find out how much gas a trip will take in a car that uses 1 gallon of gas to go 18 miles. So we just want to find what our independent and our dependent quantities are. So independent and then dependent. So the dependent is going to depend on the independent. All right, so our independent is how many miles it's going to take us to get to where we're going. So however far it is for my trip, so let's say I want to go to Florida. Well, how many miles would it take me to get there? So our independent is the number of miles in my trip. my dependent is depending on how many miles I have to go, and my dependent is going to be the number of gallons of gas. Because it's going to take a lot fewer gallons of gas to drive to Kansas than it would to drive all the way to Florida. So dependent is how many gallons it would take based on how many miles we need to go. All right, so next we're going to talk about domain and range. So our domain is our input. It's what we put into our equations. Our range is our output. It's what we get out of our equations. So if I'm thinking of it as a point, I would have my x and my y. I would plug my x into my equation and it would give me my y back out. Okay, so in the last example where we had our trip we were taking, our x would have been the miles to our destination. Our y would have been the number of gallons it would take us. Example 4, Ken burns 425 calories per hour when he bikes. He bikes from 3 to 7 hours each weekend. We need to identify the independent and dependent quantities and then find the domain and range. So we need to find our independent, our dependent, our domain, and our range. All right, so independent is something that doesn't depend on something else happening. Our dependent depends on something else. So independent is going to be how many hours he spends biking. So it's the number of hours that he spends biking every weekend. And our dependent is going to be how many calories he can burn based on how many hours he bikes. All right, because my calories burned are going to change depending on how many hours I bike. So then our domain is the information that we put into our equation. So our domain would be how many hours he's biking. Well, he's biking between 3 to 7 hours. Then our range would be how many calories he burns. So if he's biking 3 hours, we would take that 425 calories he can burn per hour and multiply it by 3. So he would burn 1,275 calories in 3 hours. Well, we want to figure out how many calories he can burn if he bikes 7 hours, the maximum amount he could bike. So we do the same thing, but plug in 7, and we would find that he would burn 2,975 calories. So our range then is 1,275 to 2,975. All right, so that is the range of calories that he could burn based on how much he biked. All right, if you had any questions with today's lesson, let me know. Check in Canvas to figure out what your homework is.